Thank you all for joining us for today's presentation, Business Connectivity Services and SharePoint in Office 2010, presented by Martin Cox. My name is Meredith Mead, and I'm the Marketing Coordinator for Neudesic and the moderator for today's webcast. This webcast is presented by Martin Cox, Neudesic's Principal Consultant for Portals and Collaboration. We are very excited to have him present for us this morning. If you're all logged on, you should be able to see the title slide that states Business Connectivity Services, BCS, and SharePoint in Office 2010. There was a brief intro earlier regarding features within Live Meeting. To briefly recap, we encourage you to ask questions throughout the session by typing them in. To ask a question, click on the Q&A verbiage located in the toolbar on the top left side of your screen. Type your question, then click the Ask button. Please note all questions will be held until the end. We will also be using the seating chart feature within Live Meeting. Changing your feedback color within this tool provides feedback to the presenter. To provide feedback, click on the feedback menu found in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. Select your feedback color. Your seat in the conference center will display your selected color. Lastly, this webcast is being recorded and will be available via the Neudesic website. We will email you when the link is available. If everyone is ready, please make sure your seat color is green. At this time, I'd like to turn our presentation over to Martin.
Hi, welcome to Business Connectivity Services in SharePoint in Office 2010. My name is Martin Cox. I'm a Principal Consultant and a SharePoint Practice Lead at Neudesic. I'm thrilled to be with you today to share with you some of what I've learned while building an Office business application using the new Business Connectivity Services in SharePoint in Office 2010. You know, the Business Connectivity Services is one of the most exciting and powerful new features in Office in SharePoint 2010. Using BCS, you can build an application that gives information workers access to back-end and line-of-business systems right within their familiar Office and SharePoint user interface. This webcast will strive to explain by example. I don't want to kill you with PowerPoint. I'll demonstrate an Office business application called Customer Information in Office 2010 as an example of the kind of applications made possible by the new BCS. Then we'll dive deep, looking at what the application does and how the BCS makes it work. But first, we'll skip this to go into we'll come back to this just on another slide. A story. Just over a year ago, Jason Noble, our SharePoint Practice Director, and I approached Greg Lush, the CIO of our good customer, the Link Group, and shared with him a little about what was coming in this next version of SharePoint in Office 2010. I described this, quote, new version of the BDC, unquote, to Greg and how it supports full CRUD, that is, create, read, update, and delete. I explained how you can use it to surface back-end business data from line-of-business systems into the rich Office client apps like Outlook and thin client apps like SharePoint, and how it allows your users to work both offline and online on the rich client because there's this cache. And Greg immediately saw how this could be valuable to the Link Group. So we decided to prototype a solution to one of the key problems Greg was facing at the Link Group. And this is where Customer Information in Office 2010 got started. So before we go any farther, let's take a quick poll. How many of you used the Business Data Catalog back in SharePoint 2007? Okay. Well, some definitely did. Most of you did not, and that is easy to understand. It was a read-only technology. You could code your own way to write back to the back-end system, but it would only read, and it only worked on SharePoint. They were switching over to the virtual machine, so let's go back and give you That's Outlook 2010, and we're going to return to that in about one slide for the technical. First, I'm going to explain the problem that we set out to solve. The problem that we set out to solve at the link group was that at the link group, they have a large workforce, and this is a lot of information workers, I don't know, 3,000, 4,000 of them. Many of them are on the road a lot, and they're interacting with and providing services to their customers. Now, the link group is very technologically savvy. They're very bullish on Microsoft technology. They do a lot to empower these road warriors, and they have Office, they have SQL, they have CRM, and of course they have SharePoint. But the problem is that these information workers, these road warriors, well, they're often disconnected from the corporate LAN. They don't have easy access to the back-end business systems like CRM that track client accounts and service requests. And even when they do, that native CRM user interface presents kind of a learning curve, a usability challenge. And they would really prefer to stick with their familiar Office applications. And that is exactly the problem that the BCS is designed to solve. So we set out to build customer information in Office 2010, a prototype Office business application using Office 2010, SharePoint 2010, and the business connectivity services. Now, this diagram describes the solution you're about to see, but rather than go into all the boxes and arrows, I'll flip straight to the demo and show you how the end result works. This is Outlook 2010. Notice that it has the ribbon up here in the Explorer bar. Notice I'm reading my email in my inbox. We've added 3 custom elements to the Outlook user interface to make working with customer data just as natural as working with email. The first we've added is this Look Up Customer Info button on the ribbon. When I have an email message selected and I click this Look Up Customer Info button, it does 3 things. The first is it opens the email message in an Outlook Inspector window. The second is it uses this email address of the sender, in this case Darlene Beckham, to look up in the accounts list for an account with a matching contact. If it finds one, it displays that account data for the matching account down in this form region. This is a form region down at the bottom of the inspector window. This form region displays information about the account, information about the contact, and related information such as recent service requests that might have happened at that account. And this gives me valuable contextual information about this email message, information I can use to decide what action to take and how best to handle this communication from my client. That is what a composite application is all about. The data in this form region comes from the account item. The account item is similar to a contact in Outlook, except that a contact synchronizes through Exchange, whereas this account item synchronizes through Dynamics AX. Clicking the company name in the account field opens the account item in a new inspector window. Now these account items, they look a lot like contact, but they're not. This is the second thing we added to the Outlook user interface after that lookup button. And notice that an account item, it looks like a contact, but fields, that's because fields like full name, first name, last name, company name, and email all map neatly to Outlook contact fields. But you can see that it's more than just a contact because it has this ID field in the bottom. Below the line are some fields that are in an account but don't map to a contact. Okay. Another distinguishing feature of an account item is that they reside in a SharePoint external list. So when you go in Outlook over to your SharePoint external lists and click this Home Accounts folder, you see all these account items in a business card format just like they're contacts. They're not contacts, however, because contacts synchronize through Exchange, whereas these items synchronize to the back-end business system. Now, because business connectivity supports full CRUD, we can create a new account. There's a new account right there. We can update an existing account. If we open one up, we can edit it. And we can delete, we can read and we can delete an account right inside this familiar Outlook user interface, even though that data is really back-end business data. So the third custom element we added, going back to my email, so suppose I've opened this email and I see this account and I want to reply to Kyle Kimball. I click reply. The third element we've added is this customer info tab on the email message. This customer info tab is gives me all manner of convenient CRM related features that I might want to perform right here in the familiar Outlook user interface. And that is the essence of a composite application. Turning our attention now to SharePoint, you see here a standard SharePoint 2010 site called Customer Info Central. And I created this site using a standard team site template, and you can see the usual doc libraries, announcements, various lists, and other standard SharePoint stuff. But in addition to those, you can see a list called Accounts. Clicking on this Accounts list, we see that it contains all our familiar account entities. There's Kyle Kimball, Ackerman and Company. There's Darlene Beckham of Beckham Radiator. This is the same exact data we were just looking at in Outlook. The difference here is that we're looking directly at live data in the backend system. It's not cached as it was in Outlook on the client. The accounts list is what is known in SharePoint as a 2010. This account list is what is known as an external list. It means it looks and acts like a standard SharePoint list, but the data actually resides in the backend system, not in the SharePoint content database. Just as well as we did in Outlook, we can create, go to items, we can create a new account here, we can edit an existing account. The only thing I've intentionally left out is delete. As you can see, as you hover over delete, it says that it's disabled. I intentionally removed the delete method so that we could look next at Visual Studio and learn how the delete method would be added using the business connectivity services. This is Visual Studio 2010. I have the customer information in Office 2010 solution open and the BDC model open in the design surface. In this context, Visual Studio gives me 4 windows or quadrants to work in, each with a different and helpful paradigm for developing the entity model in the .NET connector code by which it talks to the back end. The 4 windows or quadrants are, going clockwise from the upper left, the BDC design surface, the BDC Explorer, the properties window, and the BDC Method Details. The BDC design surface in the upper left, you can see my entity, also known as an external content type, named account, displayed kind of like you might see in an ER diagram. Its property has properties like this identifier, and it has methods. In the BDC recognizes 5 what they call stereotype methods on back-end entities. In general, it can perform any one of a read list, a read item, a create, update, or delete. And as you can see right now, the account entity has all these methods except delete. We will demonstrate exactly how you go about adding that method now. In the upper right, we have the BDC Explorer. The entity model at its core is a big, complicated XML document, and this BDC Explorer encapsulates that document. You can easily navigate through the hierarchical structure of your entity model using this BDC Explorer. Now, while I'm here, let me convey tip number 1 for working with the new BCS. There's a property of the model called incremental update. So when you select your model, in my case it's called DAX model, then the properties down below, there's this property called incremental update. Okay. my tip number one is to set this property to false, like you see it here. The default value is true. Now, when incremental update equals true, that means when you press F5 to debug, Visual Studio will only build and run the new C#.NET code that you've written for your connectivity. If you changed any identifiers or entity names in your model, they'll be out of sync with your code, and that will lead you to errors and frustration. Incremental update equals false tells Visual Studio to completely uninstall and remove your old solution, rebuild and reinstall your new solution. It is slower, but it gives you more predictable results. And that is tip number one. In the lower left pane, we have the Bdc Method Details. With my account entity selected and the designer surface above, the Method Details window gives me a way to scroll through and work with the methods defined on that entity. There's my read list method with its parameters. There's my read item. There's my create. There's my update. To add my delete method, I scroll all the way to the end of the list of the methods and find a row that says add a method. You see here that it offers me a drop-down with choices for some of the different stereotype methods. From this drop-down, I select Create Deleter Method. Now watch what happens. Three things happen when I select Create Deleter Method. First is that Visual Studio automatically adds the delete method to the count entity displayed graphically in the design surface. Right there is the delete. Second is that it automatically added the delete method to the entity XML, to the model, the BDC model XML, and you can see it right up there. The third is that it added a stub for the code into my C#.NET connector code. We have to go in and change that code now. These four design surfaces are helping you to develop. It's worth stepping back and saying what these four surfaces are doing are helping you to build two things. The first one is really your BDC model XML document, okay? And the second is your connector code. In this case, it's this account services.C# code. Double-clicking on my new delete method takes me to the stub of that method that Visual Studio inserted for me with the right syntax. Now I'm going to go ahead and delete out that stub code and insert the code that actually talks to my backend system. From my desktop, I have a handy-dandy bit of text. There's my delete cs.txt file open, and you can see there's my actual delete method. Similarly, going over to the, we need to adjust the method instance XML, the Visual Studio automatically to the BDC model. Now, as nice as the BDC Explorer is, you will find that you still need to roll up your sleeves and edit the XML by hand. So here's a technique. The standard way you do this here, and in all Visual Studio XML Explorers, is to right mouse click on the XML document. In this case, it's DAX model .bdcm, and select open with ... Okay. Say yes, and select open with an XML editor. Okay. You're now editing the BCS entity model in its native XML. I might also pause right here and show you something you'll need to achieve something that I demo at the end of this, and that is property name equals Outlook item, type equals string, contact. You see where I specify contact? That is where the model tells Office that items of this entity type map nicely into contact items in Office, into the Outlook item type contact. Okay, that's a really important little element right there. You'll need it to be able to repeat the thing I do in the very last demo, which is connect to Outlook. So if you have your, you can see in this XML document that you have all your lob systems, your instances, your methods, your entities, and the instances of those methods, and the parameters for the instances of those methods. All in all, this is pretty complicated XML. So it's nice to have the BDC Explorer. So I'm going to go all the way down to where it added my delete method. And I'm going to take out what Visual Studio added and insert what I know I need. And you can see what I need is this method element. It specifies, oh, there is a method called delete. It takes these parameters, and when you go to call it, one of the instances you can call is also called delete, but that will go and look at a method in my C# code called delete, which we just saw. Saving all this and building to see if I introduced any build errors. We build all succeeded. You can now press F5 to build, deploy, and run this baby. Visual Studio is retracting the old solution, building my .NET connector assembly, packaging it together with my entity model as a solution package, adding this solution package to my SharePoint site, and installing it. Then it launches Internet Explorer to the website where my entity is now available. And now in Internet Explorer and in SharePoint, I can go to my external list. I can add a new external list to just display my new entity. In my case, however, my accounts list still, I didn't change the namespace of this entity, so I can simply go to my existing accounts list and see that now I can do a delete. Armin Wallace, item, delete item. Are you sure? Okay. And by the way, that goes directly to the backend system. So Armand, he's really gone. That was demo number 1. Let's do another quick poll. Does your company store information in back-end business systems, such as SAP, Siebel, Dynamics, or Oracle? The link group had easily 4 different back-end systems. We were talking to a Zapta, Microsoft Dynamics Zapta, that's spelled A-X-A-P-T-A, Zapta, and Microsoft Dynamics CRM, and then there was another CRM, and then there was a custom-built system that tracked their service requests. Almost all respondents answered yes, so obviously back-end business systems are popular and common, and therefore accessing that information might be important. Now, some of you, slides. That's the intro slide. Apologies. Let's go find my. Here we go. Okay. Some of you may be wondering how you get started creating a solution that uses the BCS. And for you, this next demo shows how to create a brand new minimal BCS solution from scratch. Switching back to my machine, development machine, and going back to Visual Studio, File, New, let's close this project, File, close this file, close this solution, debugging. Say File, New, Project, and then under under the many different included templates, there's SharePoint, and under SharePoint, there's 2010, and under 2010, there's all these new templates for Visual Studio solutions. One of them is the Business Data Connectivity Model. So you pick that guy, and you give it a name. Let's call it Demo. And this name, by the way, will show up as the start of the namespace of your external content type. So it'll be demo.something. Click OK, and it asks me what SharePoint site to use when I debug. And by the way, these BCS solutions cannot be deployed as a sandbox solution. Click Finish, and this gives you a bare minimum external content type named Entity1 with a read list method and a read item method. F5 builds and deploys this just like we saw before. In this case, we don't already have the list, so once we get into Internet Explorer, we have to go to Lists, Create, and create our new external list. Lists, Create. SharePoint developers just drool when they look at all these great new kinds of lists that you can create in SharePoint 2010. But the one we want is called External List, Create. And in addition to the usual list name, we'll call it something useful like equity. And remember the external content type? Well, this is a catalog of all your content types. And if I pop that open, you'll see our demo as well as our old friend f.fax.account that I demoed earlier. So BDC demo.bdcmodel1.entity1, click OK. That's the external content type for this list. Click Create, and SharePoint creates a virtual list with that one and only one stub entity with the ID 0 and the message called Hello World. You can read the list, you can read the item, but you haven't added any of the other stereotype methods. You can't create, update, or delete. Let's take another quick poll. For your site or for your company or your clients, do your information workers sometimes work offline, disconnected from Exchange, SharePoint, in the corporate LAN? I ask this question because rich client office applications like Outlook and Groove provide a great way to liberate your application from having to always be connected to the corporate LAN. All right, we definitely have more people who said yes than no. So people still take their laptops and go work in places where they don't have connectivity. That is the reality. You know, I've been hearing for 10 years how we're going to have internet everywhere, and why have any kind of offline? You can just browse for everything. And just in 10 or 20 years, it still hasn't happened. So the rich client is still alive and well. It has an important place as for composite applications. Let's go on to, we asked this question. Let's go on to demo number 3. The rich client, one thing about rich client applications, however, is that those of you who've deployed rich client applications, well, you know they sometimes come with trade-offs. Mainly deployment, right? You get this nice app, but it's supposed to run on everybody's client, so then you have to somehow deploy and update this to all your users' client machines. My last demo will demonstrate how SharePoint 2010 plays a pivotal role in taking composite applications offline, or no, taking composite applications and deploying them out to as many end-user client systems as possible. So I'm going to close my browser, okay, and go to Outlook. Close it, turn up my Outlook windows. Okay. So we're back in Outlook, and we saw the accounts folder in Outlook 2010. I'll delete this SharePoint external list called home-accounts. See delete folder? Are you sure? Yes. Gone. That puts Outlook back into the default state where it does not have the list of accounts and does not have the BCS model that defines how you talk to the back-end business systems. The way end users get the BCS model and the list of account entities is through SharePoint. We go back to SharePoint. When they open the accounts virtual list in SharePoint, as we showed in Demo 1, and navigate to the list item in the ribbon, here's all the different actions that can be taken on the list as a whole. And over here, there's a button called Connect to Outlook. Pay attention, folks. This Connect to Outlook button has got to be the single greatest feature in SharePoint 2010 related to the business connectivity services. When I click this button, SharePoint automatically packages up the BCS model for this external content type along with the C#.NET connector, launches Outlook, and downloads, when it works, downloads the package to my Outlook Rich client. Then inside Outlook, it installs the package, adds the SharePoint external list to my Outlook folders, and loads all the data into my Outlook Rich client. Let's try closing out Outlook and seeing if we can try that again. I will not try this long because I know we're short on time, but that is my third and final demo. We will, okay, it will be unlikely to get, what we might want to do is go back to our file, close out this solution, reopen our solution called f.dax. What's that? .dax, that account, right? Rebuild. There's our solution. Let's see. We'll rebuild this and okay. Let's just try start launch Visual Studio as administrator. And in just a moment, I will give up and go for questions, but it's worth one last shot here. We're opening the solution that has our good old familiar account item. There's our account item with its delete method. Go to Solution Explorer, right mouse click, and rebuild the solution. Then we'll right mouse click and actually deploy that solution. Don't need to debug right now. Deploy started in the lower left corner, recycling IIS, retracting solution, adding solution, deploy succeeded, and let's go back to SharePoint. We'll refresh SharePoint. Should load this account list again from the backend business system. We'll go to the List tab on the ribbon and try that Outlook take it offline into that connect to Outlook button. Okay, going back to the list, connect to Outlook, preparing external list for synchronization with Outlook, installing Office customization, install. It's bringing that package down into Outlook. It's launching Outlook. Preparing Outlook for external list, setting up the store. There's Outlook launching. Boom, SharePoint external lists has shown up. Home accounts shows up, and my Outlook rich client now has the local cache of all this back-end business data. And I want to make two quick points before we wrap. I can now go offline and work with this data, all changes being cached and queued locally for later synchronization. Another important point, significantly, is that the BCS here on my Outlook client, what synchronizes directly to the back-end business system. It doesn't go through SharePoint. Remember, that virtual list over in SharePoint is not stored in SharePoint. It's stored in the back-end business system. So both the SharePoint client and the Outlook client and anybody else's Outlook client with the same data are all talking to the same back-end business system, which is the system of record. So you don't get those sort of confusions to which, you don't have a lot of copies. Switching back to the slides. In conclusion, we've seen that there's a world of improvement between the old BDC and the new BCS, also in SharePoint and very much in Visual Studio 2010. I've tried to convey some tips, tricks, and lessons learned along the way, but here are a few more. We managed to talk about incremental update equals false, and there's a couple of these other things. As you add the read method or add the updater method, there's a few little properties you want to set. I won't go into details right now. Lesson learned number one, however, is know your line of business. That back-end business system can really be your biggest challenge. It was my biggest challenge building this, interfacing to the back-end business system, because I was talking to Dynamics AX, and it does support web services, but let me tell you, they were not friendly in terms of getting what I wanted done. So there are no-code approaches. I won't go into that today. Lessons learned number two is, because there's a lot of business logic sometimes in terms of what's legal and what's correct in terms of your data, other enterprises are developing mid-tier servers. They start up a Windows server, and they code a server-side solution that talks to those back-end systems and exposes a Windows communication service, a WCS or web services interface that your BCS client on your rich client can then consume neatly. That's all for today, but we do have time for a couple quick questions.
Thank you, Martin, for this awesome presentation. We did have a few questions that came through. For a reminder, to ask a question, click on the Q&A verbiage located in the toolbar at the top left side of your screen. Type your question, then click the Ask button. So our question is, connecting Outlook to external account lists, like to clarify how OL connects directly to the back-end system, what is the real network connectivity, protocol, etc. It really doesn't proxy through SPS services?
Correct. It does not go through SharePoint services. Remember, the data is not on SharePoint. The data is in your back end. So that the first stop is the BCS runtime. If you look at a stack of a software stack where your Outlook client is on the top or your rich client is on the top, it's making calls to the BCS runtime, which is a DLL installed on your rich client. Your BCS runtime uses the BCS catalog, or what's called the BCS model, the entity model, to figure out what methods to call in your connector code. Your connector code is where the magic is. You, in a Visual Studio solution, you write .NET code, okay, that exposes those stereotype methods to the Bcs runtime. And your .NET code does whatever it has to talk to your back-end system. I imagine some people might talk to SharePoint as their back-end system, but that's not what I was doing. Most solutions are going to talk web services to Siebel, or to Oracle, or to SAP, or some other back-end system like maybe Dynamics CRM. You can also call multiple backends from your connector code and aggregate into an entity where the actual data for that entity resides sprinkled across multiple backend systems. But to the end user in Outlook, it looks like a single object. That's one of the big motivating reasons to go with BCS. If your actual business entity, like say an equity or an account, isn't all on one backend system but is spread across multiple, then maybe you can use BCS to hide that from the end user. Next question.
Thank you, Martin. Next question. Can I use SharePoint Designer 2010 to create an external list in SharePoint, or do I have to write a connector using Visual Studio?
You do not have to write your connector in Visual Studio. There's some great code-free approaches to business connectivity services and creating virtual lists in SharePoint and taking those lists offline into the client without code. The out-of-the-box code-free connectors that come with Office 2010 are for SQL Server, for well-formed web services, and Windows Communication Services interfaces. So if some back-end system exposes a web service or a WCF interface that is clearly, mapped nicely to those stereotype methods, create, read, update, and delete, then you can begin in SharePoint Designer, discover those back-end interfaces, and SharePoint Designer will create the necessary model for you. You don't have to write it, and you don't have to write any code. And that model can then be installed on the SharePoint Designer. Will install that model, install that external list on your SharePoint site for you, and you're up and running with a virtual list, no code.
Great. Thank you, Martin. Last question. Are create, read, update, and delete the only methods supported by the BCS?
No. The BCS also has a so-called blank method. In Visual Studio, when I dropped down that list that had create creator, create reader, create updater, create deleter, there was one more there. If you look closely, it says create blank method. So you can define an arbitrary method and add that to the model and call that from your client-side code. And if you implement it in your connectivity, in your back-end connector code, it could be something like synchronize, or something like compile, or something like generate report. And you can write that method with whatever signature you want, and that will be supported by your model going forward.
Thank you, Martin. Those answers were very helpful. If anyone has any more questions, please feel free to type them in at this time. In the meantime, I'm going to click through a few polling questions, and we would greatly appreciate your feedback. First question, was this content helpful for your business? Yes or no? Give it one more second. Great, thank you. Next question, please rate the presentation content. Excellent, good, or poor? Give it one more second. Great, thank you, everyone. Last polling question, Would you like us to schedule a follow-up? Yes or no? Great, thank you. If there are no further questions, we would like to thank Martin again for the wonderful presentation. Again, we will be forwarding out the recorded version of this presentation when it becomes available. If you have any further questions about this presentation or Neudesic in general, please feel free to email Martin at martin.cox@neudesic.com. Again, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you on our next webcast. You are now free to disconnect.